Hello, family. Good morning again. As you can tell, it's a bright and early morning here in Karating. I'm hanging out with my supervisors who should be taking breakfast so we can head out to visit a local school. One of my favorite things to do with my supervisors at home during summer is to get them to see what Kenyan schools look like. And so this morning, we are getting ready to go check out a school. Hopefully, they'll spend a full day and a few days here and there to get a feel for what it means to be a Kenyan student. And that's what our day is going to look like. So, I'm going to talk about the issue of schooling as we enjoy this short video. So, this is going to be about a three-part series that is going to specifically focus on issues, schooling, and transitioning from diaspora to Kenya. And of course, as you know, many returnees or diasporans are parents. And this often means that the welfare of children remains one of the biggest considerations that folks have to grapple with as they decide whether they want to move back, when they need to move, and how that transition is going to look like. And so at this point, I want to be quite clear that my wife and I are also right in the middle of this problem. We don't have a solution yet. And this is why one of the things I'm hoping to get out of this video is to really learn from your experience and other people's experience because we haven't figured this one out. So, people who have done well, please share your experiences. Those who are struggling will be more than happy to listen to your stories. And I hope you'll also learn from listening to other folks who are going to share theirs here. Because in the last couple of weeks, many parents have been reaching out asking tons of questions about kids, what to do, what schools are good out there, how to navigate like homeschooling, and a ton of things. And we're going to discuss all of this in a three-part series. So many of the parents who have been reaching out have actually transitioned really well and have been sharing their stories. Some of them live in diaspora and have sent their kids back in Kenya. And so the kids go back and forth. And there's a very small group of folks who have really failed in this process and have ended up bringing the kids back and transitioning. And so, again, I'm hoping that this conversation is going to allow us to walk away better prepared to navigate transition related issues for diaspora parents or for parents living in the city who are thinking about moving back to the village. So, as I mentioned, this is going to be a three-part series. And in this series, I'm going to cover 7 things. Number one, I'll share some of the contextual factors at play when kids are involved with transition. Then, secondly, I'm going to talk about my knowledge about schooling in Kenya. However, excuse me. However, the knowledge I'm going to share is fairly dated. This is going to be based on my own lived experience as a kid going through school in Kenya. So most of this is 80s and 90s, and I suspect some of it has really changed. I'll also talk about my limited knowledge and experience with schooling in the US, because I'm also an educator in the US. And I'll focus on higher education. Towards the end, I'll also talk about the dilemmas for parents and kids, and then hopefully conclude this series with the discussions about what we're doing personally in our family, what other parents are doing, and then summarize some suggestions that appear to be useful for parents who are dealing with similar issues. If you didn't catch this in one of the earlier videos, I'm a professional educator. In fact, before leaving for the US, I was a high school teacher in Kisumu for 2 years. And so a lot of what I'm going to share here comes from both my experience as a student and my experience as a teacher. But remember, this information is fairly dated because it's been many, many years since I was a student or since I was a teacher in Kenya. So here are some of the contextual factors you want to keep in mind when you're thinking about diaspora parents and their kids, particularly on matters education. So number one, almost all diaspora parents that I know really want the best for their kids. And they will often do anything, including sacrificing their own desires, to make sure that their kids are getting the best of what that is. However, there are a few exceptions. Some parents make choices that may make you wonder whether they're actually prioritizing kids, but that's a very small group. The overwhelming majority of diaspora parents really desire the best for their kids. And the best for some of them often means keeping the kids in diaspora for as long as possible, possibly till their first degrees. For other parents, the best often means moving back to Kenya. Now, some of the parents I talk to from diaspora also, I would think myself included too, have this problem of living our dreams through our kids. So we take the kids to the schools that we just dreamt of, we make them take courses we desire, and in some ways shape them into careers of our choices. That is not unusual among Kenyan diaspora parents. And of course, the majority of us know very little about the Kenyan education system, in part because a lot of us have been gone for so long and so much has changed in the Kenyan education system. So we are not quite in touch with what's going on. We are rarely in touch with the teachers and scholars who are studying things education in Kenya. Of course, much of what we know is all about national results, typically for 8th grade and 12th grade. And some of it is just information that is available on social media, which sometimes can be really different from what actually happens in school. But in general, many of us in diaspora know very little about what's actually happening within the Kenyan education system today. So it's likely that we can dismiss what's happening often from a point of ignorance. And I'm using ignorance here to mean just lack of knowledge. So when you're talking to diaspora parents, here are some of the comparisons you'll hear us talk about. The number one, diaspora schools can be very safe, but at the same time, they can be very dangerous, especially when you're talking about gun violence. There's a lot of gun violence in American schools that makes them very unsafe. We've got quite a bit of racism in diaspora schools, and often the systems in place are not very culturally responsive. Our kids are taught by teachers that don't often look like them, don't speak their language, they read books that are far removed from the things that they are familiar with back at home. And of course, within the American education system, there are built in value systems that may be very foreign to African kids. Something such as individualism, where kids are taught to value the individual first before the group. Our kids find that very foreign. And of course, the issue of bullying is very prevalent in many American schools, particularly middle school and above. There's so much of that. The good news, though, is that in many places in the diaspora, particularly the US, we know education is free, especially from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. Yes, of course, in many schools, they provide free meals. Like in Long Beach, where I live, all kids get free meals. And then when you talk about special services like special education and related services like counseling services, psychological services, those are often paid for by the public. So parents don't have to pay out of pocket to get those services. And then another beautiful thing about American system is that the law mandates that the school builds systems that are accessible to people with disabilities, whether it's ramps, elevators, curriculum that is accessible. All of that is required by law. And then in many cases, the average school has relatively modern facilities such as internet, indoor plumbing, power, and things like that. And this will vary wildly depending on where a person lives. And unfortunately, in many places like in the US, where a parent lives really shapes the kind of schools that the kids have access to. Something that is probably not as big of an issue in Kenya. And of course, kids that go through the American education system may have a slightly easier system transitioning into higher education in the US. But of course, that also depends on many other factors. So here is my experience as a kid going through the Kenyan system in the 80s and 90s. And I said, I don't know how relevant this is in the current context. And so those of you who are more familiar will help us figure that out. Number one, very few kids going through the Kenyan education system actually knew their age. When we started grade one, they had a test to verify whether we were old enough. And the test was we were required to use our right hand to try and touch the left ear. And so if you're tall enough to touch your left ear, then they would assume you're old enough. So my short friends who could not do that, they would just be sent home and then they come back a year later. So it was typical that in first grade, for example, you'd find kids from age 5 up to age 11 or 12 in the same grade. And that brings me to the next point, where in Kenya, as it is true now, there are no age restrictions. So you could still be in sixth grade at 21 or 22. So kids sit in class at varying ages, which is not what you'll find in America. And of course, as a kid growing up through Kenya, through the Kenyan system, we learned a minimum of three languages. We had a tribal language taught at home, then you had two languages taught in school, that is English and Swahili. So the overwhelming majority of those of us who went to school at the time speak a minimum of three languages. Most folks speak four or five languages. Now, teaching was often done in mother tongue. This was especially true for those of us who went to school in the village. So I remember every single subject was taught in mother tongue, including Swahili and English, and it was fantastic. And mother tongue was actually another subject on its own. We loved it. So this went on up till third grade. And then as soon as we transitioned to fourth grade, then they started teaching most things in English. And of course, all of our teachers spoke our mother tongue. They were all black. They understood our cultures. And so our teachers were highly, highly relatable. And at some point, I believe they were providing free milk. They would call it like Nyayo milk. It was random here and there. I don't think it was consistent, but we got it. And then, of course, the books that we read were absolutely relatable or super enjoyable. Many of them were in mother tongue. I remember reading the book titled Ogot Ginyange. We read TKK, Otiena Church, and then the English series from grade 1 to 8. Tons of books. Hello Children, Read With Us, One More Step. And I remember very specific characters like Mr. and Mrs. Kamau, very specific stories like Bogori Cook's Lunch, Grass Soup, Fatum and the Giant, Nandwa Learns a Lesson. Oh, we also read Akelo Nyarageso, Moses and the Ghost. And then when we got to high school, oh, this was the best. The interesting part is that in high school, we had a mix of both Kenyan, other African countries, and then books from Europe as well. Many of them were just super, really enjoyable. For example, we read The Government Inspector by Nikolai Gogol, The Burdens by John Ruganda, The River and the Source by the late Dr. Margaret Ogola, Looking for a Rain God, edited by Ian Gordon, Things Fall Apart by Achebe. Of course, my this was my all-time favorite book, Okot Pei Bitek's Song of Laweno and Song of Okol. This is the one book that got me hooked up to what I did in my undergraduate. Loved it, loved it. And then tons of books on oral literature. I remember reading lots of stories, the exact same stories that my grandma would tell us when we were kids. And so, as I said earlier, the books were either highly, highly relatable or they were just super enjoyable, even if they were foreign. So, in the next series, I'm going to pick up from number 11. I hope you'll stick around. I hope you subscribe so you can continue this conversation. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you in the next. Bye.
Yes. Sorry,